With concerns mounting, over 10,000 North Korean soldiers reportedly sent to Russia. North Korea's foreign minister went to Moscow while Russia's deputy foreign minister was in Beijing. According to the United States, that North Korea has sent around, again, 10,000 total soldiers to train in eastern Russia. How do we understand this relationship at this moment between Russia and North Korea? But meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping recently paid a short visit to Moscow, again, to be united with Vladimir Putin. Under the circumstances, what do we say regarding this political and also this economic relationship between China and Russia? And meanwhile, some believe that Russia today cannot afford to spend financially, given the fact that war in Ukraine has drained so much out of Putin and also Russia. Meanwhile, let's pay attention to the current presidential election in the U.S. In less than 6 days, this country is going to elect another brand new president. What signal does that send to Russia, China, and North Korea? Putting everything together, is America to readjust the direction to deal with this triangle perspectives of Russia, China, and North Korea? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, and who's Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is a historian, and he's a political scientist. He's the expert for Soviet Union, Russia, and so many international affairs. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me, Will, and thank you to your audience for listening and watching.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, it's quite alarming that on October 17th, the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky warned that 10,000 North Korean troops were set to be deployed to join Russia's fight against Ukraine. And also, this number has been confirmed by the U.S. Let's start with this alarming news. What do you make of that? Then 10,000 North Korean soldiers sent to Russia. Again, what does that say about this relationship between North Korea and Russia at this moment? And also, is this a desperate move from Vladimir Putin reach out to North Korea at this moment? Your thoughts?
Well, there are at least two answers that I can give you here. One relates to the fact that this is obviously indicative of North Korea's support of Russia. North Korea has provided Russia with millions of artillery shells. So the fact that they are now providing Russia with 10,000 soldiers is in some ways just a logical continuation of the involvement in the war. It's also the involvement of the North Koreans is also a major escalation, regardless of whether or not they prove to be effective on the field. The mere fact that Russia has invited another power to send its troops and to participate in the fighting represents a new dimension to the war. A new and possibly dangerous escalation may now take place, especially if, for instance, South Korea decides to get more intensely involved. The United States has promised to take some kind of steps. Whatever those steps are, whatever these promises are, they all suggest that there will be some kind of robust response that might even entail boots on the ground. I think that's unlikely, but it's not inconceivable. More likely than not, the amount of weaponry and ammunition that the West and South Korea has been providing Ukraine is likely to increase. After that, it's anybody's guess what will happen. But this said, it's important to keep things in perspective, because 10,000 North Korean troops, that is, of course, a significant amount. It does pale in comparison to the millions that the Russians have in their armed forces. And it pales in comparison to the 500,000 or so that the Ukrainians have. So in effect, it's a drop in the bucket. More importantly, consider the following. How will Russia actually use these forces? These are young North Koreans who have never left their country, who have no idea what Ukraine and Russia are like, who have no notion of the terrain, who have no battlefield experience, who don't speak Russian, and who have no clear sense of what exactly they're fighting for. Will they enhance Russia's ability to launch offensives, or will they get in the way? That's at least a question. Again, we don't know what the answer is, but we'll see. We'll see within the next few weeks or possibly earlier. It's conceivable that Russia may decide to use these troops as storm battalions that they'll simply send in, and then essentially they will be transformed into cannon fodder. So it's conceivable that the Russians weren't stupid in this regard. They will simply exploit the presence of the North Koreans to send them to their deaths, and then use Russian troops as second and third waves of assault. But it's hard to imagine that the North Koreans and the Russians will fight together in some coordinated fashion, because that requires communication. And the Russians don't speak Korean, and the Koreans don't speak Russian. My final point is this. Imagine that the United States invaded Mexico, and after 2.5 years, after seizing something like 1/5 of Mexico, the Mexicans push back the Americans, regain about half of the territory they initially lost, and then essentially seem to fight America to a standstill. Well, for starters, we would consider this a major victory for the Mexicans, because given the disparity in resources, ammunition, soldiers, and everything else, the American invasion should have been very easy and very quick. Then imagine that the United States turns to Canada and asks for 10,000 soldiers to assist them, to assist America in its fight against Mexico. Would we consider this a sign of strength, of American strength, or a sign of American weakness? I suggest we would consider this to be a sign of American weakness. If the Americans need to reach out to Canadians, then clearly something is very wrong with the American armed forces. So by analogy, just return to the Russian case. The fact that the Russians are asking for military assistance from North Korea, military assistance of soldiers who have no training, who have no experience, who don't have the territorial knowledge and the language skills, is in fact a sign not of Russian strength, but of Russian weakness, and I'd go further, of Russian desperation. That said, it's still an escalatory move, and it could have all sorts of complicated consequences for everybody concerned. We'll see within the next few weeks.
Dr. Motyl, let's bring in another word that you and we briefly discussed during the previous shows. The word is called reciprocity. I mean, again, as someone who traveled to Pyongyang a couple years ago, and I would never forget that how dedicated the North Koreans were to the country, and also how the North Koreans expressed their what we called patriotism and loyalty to the country. Even again, many of them told me straight in person that there's nothing more important to honor the founding fathers and also the current leader of the country. Now, with that said, I mean, again, as you mentioned before, that those 10,000 North Korean soldiers were sent to Russia. But we are living in the age, especially we're looking at this no longer just multicultural, but it's a multi-partnership world. So what does North Korea gain in return? I mean, again, this is not a small number. This is a significant number. And also, how should we evaluate this personal tie between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin at this moment? So in other words, there's no free lunch, as we say in reality. So what do you think that the North Koreans expect in return? Is this another type of alliance, or I hate to use the word, another type of promise that from Russia to North Korea, if anything goes wrong between US and North Korea or any other country that can provoke or challenge the status quo of North Korea? What do you say to that?
Well, there are two things that North Korea expects, maybe more, but two things that come immediately to mind. One is the fact that having supplied Russia with soldiers, because Russia claims to have been attacked, which of course is false, but that's part of the Putin narrative, North Korea would in turn expect Russian military assistance. In fact, they would expect Russian soldiers, boots on the ground, in case it were to be attacked. And of course, no one's planning to attack North Korea, but it's perfectly possible that Kim Jong-un would stage a provocation of some kind, along the lines of what Putin did vis-a-vis Ukraine, and thereby claim that South Korea, possibly the United States, but more probably South Korea, launched some kind of attack on the existence of the state. And therefore, Russia needs to rush to the assistance of North Korea by supplying it with possibly weapons, more likely with troops on the ground. That's clearly part of the quid pro quo. We provide you with soldiers, and in return, you provide us with soldiers. Now, whom would these soldiers, these Russian soldiers, be fighting? Highly unlikely that this would be the United States. I can't imagine an American conflict with North Korea, or at least not a direct conflict. More likely than not, obviously, it would be South Korea. And the South Koreans, as you know, are worried. They take this escalation very seriously because it suggests that Kim has ambitions that go beyond the boundaries of his own country. And if he's willing to send troops to Ukraine, he might be willing to send troops across the demilitarized zone into South Korea. The other quid pro quo that North Korea expects is, of course, technical and technological. The Russians have apparently promised already in the past to provide them with assistance with their nuclear weapons program, with their ballistic missiles program. And now that North Korea has actually provided Russia with these soldiers, it has the right to demand, not just ask, it has the right to demand some kind of return. So instead of Russian soldiers on the ground, which North Korea may want or may not want, they would certainly want the kind of technological assistance that would enable them to build up their ballistic missile program, their nuclear weapons program, and the like. And Putin, for better or for worse, will have to comply because North Korea has taken an enormous step in providing Russia with these soldiers. This is no longer, regardless of what this all means for the war, it's a big step, as you said. 10,000 soldiers is 10,000 soldiers. That's a large contingent. And it requires that Russia pay back in some fashion.
Dr. Motyl, let's bring China into our conversation. Now, again, as I mentioned in the intro, that while we're paying attention to this exchange between Russia and North Korea, that the Russia's deputy foreign minister was in Beijing lately, and also he met with the Chinese foreign minister as well. And some believe that China has attempted to downplay any trilateral security partnership between itself, North Korea, and Russia. Now, let's go to the very simple question. How much do we believe that China today, it's actually just based on this matter, North Korea sent 10,000 troops to Russia, that China is actually just closely only watched, but without showing any attitude or without showing any indication that this is another strategic play, or it's another strategic move that based on this trilateral relationship. So in other words, what role does China play, and how much do we believe that China tried to downplay this security partnership? What do you say to that?
China can't possibly be happy with this intensification of North Korean assistance to Russia, or with Russia's continuing flirtation with North Korea. Until recently, China clearly was the hegemon, was the dominant power, and North Korea was clearly the subordinate power. And it's somewhat of an exaggeration, but not much to say that essentially China dictated to North Korea what its behavior should be. It was the protector of North Korean interests, both economic and political, as well as diplomatic. And then, of course, it required in return that the North Koreans pretty much follow whichever line the Chinese pursue. Russia has suddenly intruded on this bilateral relationship and has created what you call this triangular relationship. Again, from China's point of view, this is clearly a Russian encroachment on Chinese territory, on political territory, not geographic territory. The Russians are now trying to play a role in a relationship that until now was largely, if not exclusively, within the domain of China. So they can't possibly be happy with this in general. Then secondly, they can't be delighted with the fact that the North Koreans are getting militarily involved in the war. This has the potential to destabilize not just conditions within Ukraine and Russia, but conceivably embolden North Korea to take some kind of military steps against South Korea. On the one hand, China is pleased with a certain amount of arrogance on the part of the North Koreans. But all of these moves by Russia, by China, by North Korea, the military assistance, the increasing Russian assistance for the North Korean military programs, all of these moves are destabilizing the Chinese-North Korean relationship. They are also destabilizing China's relationship with Russia, because that too has been largely dominant, with Russia playing the role of a junior partner, essentially a colony. And now this colony seems to be forming some kind of alliance with another colony, namely North Korea. Again, Beijing can't possibly be happy with these developments. The question is, what can it do to stop them? Does it want to stop them, or does it simply want to control them? Again, we'll see what the response is. But none of this bodes well for Chinese interests, which have always been centered on stable hegemony, stable control, and in general stability. And all what the Russians and the North Koreans are doing are adding a very large element of instability into what had until now been a very stable set of relations.
Dr. Motyl, I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, again, going back to the conversation that I mentioned briefly, the Chinese President Xi Jinping recently made a brief trip to Russia, and mainly he was invited to attend the BRICS summit. Now, this is what he said on the sideline that when he encountered Vladimir Putin, and I quote, "The world is currently undergoing profound changes unseen in a century. The international situation is intertwined with chaos, but I firmly believe that China and Russia have always been major countries serving the people and will not change, end quote. Also, as I mentioned to you, Dr. Motyl, less than 6 days that we are going to see a brand new president in the White House for the US. Now, by dissecting or interpreting Xi Jinping's word, what do you think that we should understand his tone of voice, and also what does that say about the stake that for China, US, and Russia at this moment? I mean, again, clearly if Xi Jinping is sending a strong message to say both countries have always been a major country serving the people and will not change, what is that a direct message to the West to say, hey, listen, regardless who's going to win to be the next president, Harris or Trump, for the relationship between for Russia and Russia and China will never be changed. What do you say to that?
My own hunch is that this message, this quotation, was primarily directed at Putin and the Russians, less so again at the West. Essentially, what Xi Jinping is saying is that we're friends, we're partners, we both love our people, which of course is absurd. And of course, when one looks at the history of the relationship between China and Russia, there's war, there's fighting, there's imperialism, there's lack of concern for the populations of both countries. So, but be that as it may, we can forget that and put it to the side. Essentially, Xi was simply saying, we're friends, we think of you as our friends, and we will always think of you as our friends in this chaotic multinational world. Of course, that's just rhetoric, and that's important to keep in mind, because Xi knows just as well as Putin knows that the relationship between Russia and China is one-sided. China is clearly the dominant power, and Russia is clearly the subordinate power. Militarily, economically, politically, socially, demographically, in every single respect, China is the hegemon, and Russia is essentially playing the second violin, is the subordinate power. But Xi can't say that. It would be undiplomatic and very un-Chinese of him to say, hey, we're in charge and you're just our colony. So instead, he says exactly the opposite. Oh, we're friends. We will build this new multinational order. In fact, a look at the statistics shows that it's an asymmetrical relationship, which is another way of saying that it's essentially a dominant-subordinate relationship. It's a relationship between, and that might be called colonial, where Russia increasingly provides raw materials and China provides Russia with manufactured goods. But the size of the economy, the size and effectiveness of the military, all these things that go into the notion of hard power, it's so clearly skewed in China's favor that it's just, again, no politician in the West will take that seriously. That said, Xi is obviously saying that he supports Russia. The question is, how far will that support go if Russia begins to destabilize the geopolitical map of Eurasia? And that's at least an open question. All right? Now, so we need to keep the reality in mind. I mean, there is the rhetoric, which is always optimistic and suggests that things are moving ahead in precisely the desired fashion. And then there's the reality. And the reality is just very, very different from the rhetoric. And Putin must know that. He can't possibly have any illusions about the quality of his army or the quality of his economy at this point in time.
Dr. Motyl, I want to wrap up our conversation again, going back to the question I asked before. U.S. is going to elect a brand new president. And right now, we know that in addition to domestic concerns, we're looking at the abortion debate, and also look at the economy, the border crisis, and putting everything together. Still, American voters are still very much interested that who will be the best representation for the U.S. when the new president travels overseas, especially to deal with enemies and also to continue to hone the relationship with the allies. So at this moment, I am not going to ask you this A or B question whether Trump or Harris, but from your perspective, how will the next president should prepare the strategies and also the understanding for this upcoming years that we are continue to see Russia, China, and China, North Korea, and also the war in Ukraine, and so the war in Israel and Gaza, just putting everything together. What should be the person understand the complication of the world matters today, and also come up with tangible and satisfying strategies able to minimize the threat, to restore the American value to the on the international stage? Your final thoughts.
Well, I think you put the question extremely well. Who can deal with the complications? And we need to start with the complications and with a recognition of the fact that the world is becoming more and more complicated with every single day. It's becoming more complicated geopolitically, militarily, economically, environmentally, and for all sorts of reasons. And some of them have to do with the emergence of the global south. Some of them have to do with the emergence of India and China. Some of them have to do with the war in Ukraine. I could go on and on. But the point is, the world and the international arena have become extremely complicated. And in order to navigate, however, whether success, with maximum success, these waters, again, imagine, again, the image is good because it's like, here we are, the United States is in a boat and needs a captain. And there are all sorts of rocks and reefs and eddies and all sorts of storms. How do you pass through this and keep your boat afloat, and at the same time keep the boats of your allies afloat? Well, at a very minimum, you need to be a skilled captain. You need to understand your trade. You need to understand the seas. You need to be able to read maps. You need to be able to understand weather reports, all those things. In other words, you require knowledge and understanding and some appreciation of the complexity of issues. You can't pretend or say, oh, this is easy. I can go through these waters with my eyes closed. That's just an invitation to disaster. So again, the analogy with a captain of a ship is, I think, quite appropriate here. And by extension, what does that mean for the next president? This has to be an individual who appreciates the complexity of international relations, who appreciates the complexity of America's role within the world, who understands that there are many countries, that they have different kinds of interests. Some of them are supportive of American interests, some of them are not. In any case, this has to be a person who goes in with his or her eyes open, with the understanding in the head, and in the possession of a significant amount of knowledge. One can't just go in and say, oh, trust me, everything will be fine because I'm smart. You have to prove that you're smart. You have to prove that you know what you're talking about. You have to prove that you understand how complex the world is. From that point of view, and again, I think that's indisputable. That would be true at any time in American history, but it's especially true today when things are so terribly complicated in the world and where there are so many dangerous spots in the world. One false move, and this isn't really an exaggeration, but one false move could lead to a world war.
Well, Dr. Moto, I agree with you 100%. One misstep can lead to chaos. And of course, you put in a better way that as a leader, that the person shall make decisions not based on temperament and not based on emotion, but also to based on logical reasoning, understanding the history, and also willing to listen to the consultants and also the wisdoms around the person. So again, it's not an emotional choice that when we deal with international matters. Well, again, we don't know what will happen after 6 days. Again, who will be the next president? And also, we still don't know what Vladimir Putin will do with the 10,000 North Korean soldiers. And also, most importantly, that we still haven't heard anything from China yet. Well, with all the questions up in the air, and we shall see what would happen after the election. And hopefully, we can have better answers. Well, again, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's always been a pleasure. Again, you are a renowned historian and a political scientist. And again, we love to have you back on the show. And hopefully next time we talk will be after the election in the US. And again, thank you so much for doing this.